Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. On behalf of the Bodhgaya Temple Management Committee and the Mahabodhi Mahavihara Bodhgaya, we have all assembled this evening under the sacred Bodhi tree to accord a warm welcome to the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi of New Jersey, USA. We have organized a talk on enlightenment for a duration of 45 minutes. The Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi of New York is an eminent monk, scholar, author, translator, teacher, and leading Western authority on Theravada Buddhism. Most Venerable's contribution to English translation of key divisions of the Pali Canon sets a new standard in the works pioneered by the Pali Text Society, London. After completing a degree in philosophy, the Most Venerable entered the monastic order, receiving full ordination in Sri Lanka in the year 1973 under the late Venerable Balangoda Ananda Maitreya Mahathera. After the retirement of Venerable Nyanaponika in 1984, the Most Venerable served as the editor and later as the president of the Buddhist Publication Society, Kandy, Sri Lanka. The Most Venerable is the author, translator, editor of many important books and essays, as well as the creator of 10 audio lectures on the fundamentals of the Buddha's teachings. On its first official celebration of Vesak in May 2000, the United Nations invited the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi to deliver the keynote address and teaches at the Bodhi Monastery in New Jersey, where he serves as president of the Sangha Council of the Bodhi Monastery and chairman of the Ian Shun Foundation.
Yadidang chattari purisa yugani atta purisa puggala yesa bhagavato savaka sangho ahuneyo pahuneyo dakineyo anjali karaniyo anuttarang punyaketa lokasati yasa mule nisinnowa Chabbari Vijayang Akapato Sabbang Satta Vande Tang Bodhipadapa Imehete Mahabodhi Lokanatena Pojita Ahampite Namasame Bodhirata Namatute Bhavatu Sabbamangala Nakantu Sabba Devata Sabba Buddha Nubhavena Sada Sunti Bhavantu Te Bhavatu Sabba Mangala Nakantu Sabba Devata Sabba Dhamma Nubhavena Sada Sunti Bhavantu Te Bhavatu Sabba Mangalang Rakantu Sabba Devata Sabba Sanghanubhavena Sada Sutti Bhavan.
The traditional account of the life of the Buddha, as probably almost all of you know, relates a very charming story that the Bodhisattva, the future Buddha, Prince Siddhartha, had grown up in the environment of the palace, and because his father wanted to protect him from knowledge about the realities, the harsh realities of life, so through the first 29 years of his life, he knew nothing of old age, sickness, and death, and he discovered this only when he made an outing outside the city of Kapilavastu, and he encountered for the very first time an old man, then a sick man, then a corpse at a funeral procession, and then finally the sight of a sannyasi, a renunciant. But of course, we cannot take the story literally, but we should see it as a kind of, say that, a mythological representation of a process that was taking place. We find the psychological counterpart to this charming story. And here I have in mind two particular suttas. One occurs in the Anguttara Nikaya. It's the Book of Threes, sutta number, I think it's sutta number 39. Here Buddha relates, explains that when he was young, he was brought up very delicately with all of the luxuries and conveniences of a princely life. He says that his father had built for him 3 mansions, one for each season in the 3 different seasons in the Indian climate, the hot season, the cold season, the rainy season. He would spend the rainy season in the upper story of the palace, not coming down at all through the whole 3-month period, always surrounded by musicians, he adds, none of whom were male. In other words, they were all female musicians and dancers. He had 3 lotus palms blossoming with different colored lotuses. And yet, he says, amidst all of this luxury, this life of luxury, 3 thoughts occurred to him. First thought occurred to him that when an ordinary person sees an old person, he feels repelled, anxious, and even disgusted, because a young person somehow lives in the illusion that they're going to be young forever. And when one sees an old person, then it comes as a kind of stark reminder that one is subject to old age, and the immediate impulse of the mind is to block that out, to sort of camouflage it so that one doesn't recognize the reality of old age as a universal law. And yet the Bodhisattva continues, for me, a person with wisdom, it's not suitable that I should become repelled by the sight of an old person. I should rather reflect that I too am subject to old age, that I have not escaped old age. And then he says, when I reflected in that way, then the vanity of youth vanished from me. So this was, we call this like the first awakening of the Bodhisattva. The second awakening is parallel. He says, when an ordinary person, an ordinary deluded person, encounters a sick person, he feels repelled and anxious and disgusted. And I relate to that in my own experience, because apart from my childhood, when I had to have a little operation at the age of 5, the tonsils removed, up to my middle 20s, I had never been in a hospital. And whenever I would pass by a hospital, in the city streets, it always caused some kind of displeasure in me, almost below the threshold of awareness, until when I was in Sri Lanka, there was a period when I got ill and I had to spend a long time in the hospital. And then I came face to face with the reality of the many different illnesses to which the human body is subject. So this is the Bodhisattva reflecting, and then he continues that when he recognized that I too am subject to illness, that I've not escaped to illness, then the vanity, the pride of health vanished from me. Because now he recognized the universal law that every human being, every living being is subject to illness. Okay, then the third awakening came when he reflected When an ordinary person sees a corpse, then he feels repelled, anxious, disgusted, because he's trying to hide from himself the fact that death is the universal law for all of life. But he continued, if I were to think in that way, I wouldn't be any different from an ordinary foolish person. And so he continued that I had to recognize the fact that I too am subject to death, that I have not escaped from death. And he says, when I reflected in that way, then the vanity of life, the pride of life vanished from me. So this is the awakening, the Buddha's awakening, the threefold awakening to the realities of old age, sickness, and death. The psychological process that lies behind that legend of the life of the Buddha. Okay, the second sutta that's relevant to understand the beginning of the Buddha's quest for enlightenment comes in the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses, sutta number 26. In this sutta, the Buddha speaks about how in the past, when he was an unenlightened person, he sought things that were subject to birth, old age, sickness, and death, things that are subject to sorrow, things that are subject to corruption. And then he goes on to expand what are the things that he sought that were subject to birth, old age, sickness, and death. And he mentions the things that an ordinary person of that period would consider to be valuable assets, valuable acquisitions. He mentions wife and children, cattle and horses, pigs and goats, mansions and vehicles, and many other things that a wealthy person of that time could possess. Today we could expand the list exponentially, but the important point that occurred in the Bodhisattva's reflection, he considered, why should I, like any other ordinary person, continue to seek after things that are subject to birth, old age, sickness, and death? Then he says, recognizing the danger, the drawback, the unsatisfactory nature of things that are subject to birth, old age, sickness, and death, I should renounce them and instead go forth to seek that which is unborn, which is unaging, which is deathless, free from sorrow, free from corruption. That is, he says, to seek nirvana, the unsurpassed security from bondage. And I think this passage shows us a kind of branching out of two different schemes of values. One scheme of values assigns priority to material possessions. The sutta uses the Pali word upadhi, which means the things that one acquires as a foundation for one's sense of identity. And so we could see how we build up our sense of identity based on the things that we possess. So nowadays people possess not horses, mares, cattle, chickens and elephants, but we have iPhones, automobiles, computers, still we have mansions, all sorts of material possessions which are sought not only as a source of pleasure, but also because they solidify the sense of identity. So that is one scheme of values. The other scheme of values is the quest for the ultimate spiritual ideal, the spiritual good, which the Buddha here calls Nibbana, the Anuttara Yoga Kema, the unsurpassed security from bondage. And in order to turn away from the quest for material things to the pursuit of the spiritual ideal, what is needed is this perception of the drawback, the danger, the unsatisfactory nature of all of those possessions and status and honors and positions on which we build up of identity, and instead recognizing that there is some good, we call this a transcendent good, that is imperishable, and that is the ultimate final goal of human life. And it's the recognition of this dichotomy of goals and the seeing the unsatisfactory nature of one and the ultimate value of the other that leads the mind to turn away from the perishable material things of the world towards the unconditioned, towards the deathless. Okay, so when the Buddha, or future Buddha, now he's still the Bodhisattva, recognized this diversity or this divergence of the two goods, the two goals of human life, he gave up the one and set out in the quest for the other. And the sutta relates the story of how he first sought to become a pupil under two of the leading meditation masters of that period. One was Alara Kalama, under whom he mastered the meditative attainment called the base of nothingness. And then under the second teacher, Uddaka Ramaputta, he mastered the still higher level of meditative attainment called the base of neither perception nor non-perception. And what he saw when he attained those two higher meditative attainments, which his teachers took those to be the ultimate attainment, the state of liberation. But the Bodhisattva saw that those states too were not the final goal. He saw that the base of nothingness was just an attainment in the realm of samadhi, the sphere of samadhi, of deep meditative absorption. And even though his teacher and all of the others of that group, that community, held that to be equivalent to liberation, the Bodhisattva saw that the attainment of that meditative state would bring rebirth into a superior realm of existence. For it said the lifespan is 60,000 mahakalpas, 60,000 great aeons. And so for 60,000 first one aeon, in the terms of modern physics, it's roughly the equivalent of, we have the theory of the Big Bang, where the universe begins as just like a little point, and then it starts to expand and expand for something like 15 billion years till it reaches a point of maximum expansion. Then it starts to contract until it all compresses back into one little intensely hot point. Okay, that is one kalpa, one great aeon. Then we have 60,000 of these. So you get reborn in the plane of nothingness, and you spend 60,000. Okay, the period of expansion, 15 billion years, period of contraction, another 15 billion years, that's 30 billion years. 30 billion years by 60,000. Anybody have a calculator with them? Okay, so it's an extremely long period of time. But then what happens at the end of that 60,000 aeons? It's sort of like the alarm clock goes off, Then you come out of your deep samadhi and you wonder what's going on. And then before you could even finish that thought, the door opens up underneath one's feet and one drops down from that realm back to rebirth in the human realm. Then you come out, little baby, crying, wah, wah, wah. Then next thing you know it, you're going to kindergarten. Then you're applying for college, then maybe for graduate school. Then you're trying to get a job. Then you're getting married. You go through the whole cycle again. The same thing, reborn into the realm of neither perception nor non-perception, except there the lifespan is said to be 84,000 years. You get 24,000 aeons longer, but again, it's not freedom from birth, old age, and death. Okay, so now continuing, we get two different versions of what happened after this in the suttas. In one version, this is the very simple version. This is in Sutta number, Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 26. The Bodhisattva leaves his two teachers. He goes wandering into the state of Magadha, which is contemporary Bihar. He finds this charming spot on the banks of the Niranjara River, and he sits down there thinking, this is a good place for practice. And then he continues, while I was sitting there, I attained the unborn, ageless, deathless, supreme security from bondage, Nibbana. So that is the extremely simple account of what took place under the Bodhi tree. But there is a longer account which comes in Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 36. Yeah, 36. In that account, after the Buddha left his two teachers, he decided to take up the dominant mode of practice that was prevalent during the period in which he was living, the practice amongst the spiritual seekers. This was the practice of extreme asceticism. So the text gives a very detailed account of the practices that he undertook. So he would reduce his intake of food till he would be fasting like 6 days out of the week, just eating a few grains of rice on the 7th day. He would be exposing his body during the hot season he would build 4 fires around him with the sun overhead at noon, exposing himself in the hot season to the heat of the fires and the sun. During the cold season, he would go diving into the cold water. He would sleep on beds made of thorns. He would go naked or just wear a loincloth. He would imitate the behavior of animals, thinking that this is the way to liberation. And so he undertook all of these experiences of extreme ascetic practice till he came to the very verge of death. Then the thought occurred to him, whatever ascetics in the past have undertaken the practice of extreme self-mortification, none has taken that practice to the same extent that I have. Whatever ascetics in the future will undertake the practice of extreme asceticism, none will undertake it to the same extent that I have taken it. Whatever ascetics at present are pursuing this practice of self-mortification, none have followed it to the same extent that I have. But what I have found, he said, is that by this extreme practice of asceticism does not lead to higher wisdom and realization, but only to the torment of the body. Then at that moment, when he was in a kind of crisis where he had exhausted all of the approaches that he had taken, there came to him the memory of an event that took place in his childhood. When he was a young boy, his father, as the leader of the Sakyans, was charged with every year there would be, at the beginning of they call this the planting season, there would be a festival to begin I don't know the farming terms, where you plow, the beginning of the plowing of the field. And so there would be a ceremony of plowing where the leader, in this case his father, would be the first one to plow the field. And so his father brought him along with him, brought the little boy along with him, and put him under a tree in order to rest in the shade of the tree while his father and the other Sakyan leaders were plowing the fields. And while he was sitting there, this little boy, just spontaneously, he crossed his legs and then started to focus on the breath. And then while he was just being mindful of the breath, sort of unexpectedly, his mind went into a state of meditative absorption. This is what is later comes to be called the first jhana, or first dhyana, the first absorption. And so now, in his maturity, when he's given up the practice of extreme asceticism, there comes to mind an experience of the first jhana, the meditative absorption, when he was a child. And the question comes to his mind, could that be the way to enlightenment? And when that question comes to his mind, spontaneously the answer comes, yes, that's the way to enlightenment. But then he realizes, with my body just reduced to skin and bone, it wouldn't be possible for me to practice that vigorous meditation. So he decides, let me start to resume taking normal food. And so he starts going on alms round, receiving offerings of food, gradually starts to increase his intake of food until he starts to regain his strength. And when this happens, at that time, it said that there were 5 ascetics who were attending upon him. And when these 5 ascetics, they were attending on him, realizing that the former prince at Hatha, the Bodhisattva, is so earnest and so dedicated in his practice that if anybody is going to attain enlightenment, it will be our leader, Prince Siddhartha. But now they see him taking normal food again, gaining his weight, gaining his strength, and they think he's given up the quest, he's gone back, reverted to a life of luxury. And so they get disgusted with him and they abandon him. And they leave the vicinity of this area, the Bodhi tree, and they take this long walk over to Varanasi. And so now he's all alone here. Okay, in one account, this is the account that we have in Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 36. The Bodhisattva now, after regaining his strength, then he sits down cross-legged, and then he enters into the first jhana, then going beyond that to the second, the third, the fourth jhana, until in the fourth jhana, his mind becomes deeply concentrated, absorbed, pure, imperturbable, unshakable, free from blemishes. And then he uses that powerful, concentrated mind. In the first watch of the night, he begins to recollect his previous lives. He recollects 1 life, 2 lives, 3, 4, 5 lives. Then it seems that the count starts to go quicker and quicker than 10 lives, 20, 30, 40, 50 lives, hundreds of lives, thousands of lives, hundreds and thousands of lives, many cosmic aeons of expansion and contraction. So he says that was the first bija, the first clear knowledge that occurred to me in the first watch of the night. He says, darkness was dispelled, light arose. Ignorance was dispelled, knowledge arose. As I sat there, meditating diligently. Then in the second watch of the night, he says, I turned my mind to the passing away and rebirth of beings. And so again, with the divine eye, he sees sentient beings passing away from one state of existence and taking rebirth in other states of existence. And what he sees is that sentient beings move from life to life, from realm to realm, in accordance with their karma, with their volitional actions. And so now he's penetrating the underlying dynamics of the cycle of birth and death, seeing that what determines one's movement through the cycle is one's accumulations of unwholesome and wholesome karma. So those who violate the basic principles of ethics accumulate unwholesome karma, leading to misfortune and a bad rebirth. Those who accumulate wholesome and good karma take rebirth in fortunate realms, where they reap the results of their good karma. And so now he's seeing this law of karmic retribution operating through the entire extent of samsaric existence. This law that works invariably, inflexibly, the law of karmic retribution. Okay, so that, he says, that was the second knowledge that occurred to me, the knowledge that occurred in the middle watch of the night. Then he says, in the third watch of the night, I turned my mind to the knowledge of the destruction of he uses I'll use the Pali word asavas, a word very difficult to translate. The word asava comes from the root su, or the verb sabati, which means to flow. So the asavas are things that flow. They're the defilements, the way I understand them, the defilements that exist at the very base of the mind, and that when provoked by our contact with sensory stimuli, flow into active consciousness. So these are the three asavas of sensual desire, craving for continued existence, and ignorance. And so he says, as I was sitting there, I turned my mind to the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas. And then he says, as I contemplated, I understood this is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way, the path that leads to the cessation of suffering. So he comes to see and to understand the Four Noble Truths. So even though the Four Noble Truths might be like a later schematic representation of his experience, but what took place as he's contemplating is a breakthrough from the conditioned to the unconditioned, a breakthrough that he came to formulate as the understanding of the Four Noble Truths. And then he says, as I recognized these Four Noble Truths, my mind was liberated from the asava, the defilement of sensual craving. My mind was liberated from the asava of craving for existence. My mind was liberated from the asava of ignorance. And then he says, this was the knowledge that occurred to me in the third watch of the night. As darkness was dispelled, light arose. As ignorance was dispelled, clear knowledge arose. Okay, after the Buddha made this breakthrough to the penetration of the Four Noble Truths, the liberation of the mind from the asavas, at that point, he makes that transition from being a bodhisattva, a seeker of enlightenment, to being a sammasambuddha, a fully enlightened one. Okay, the texts then give several different accounts of what took place in that period immediately after the Enlightenment. And it always strikes me that this is an amazing scene. I wish that I had ability to make films, because it's quite a remarkable scene that here the Buddha is sitting here just as the dawn is beginning. Now he's fully eradicated all the traces of ignorance. He's sitting there as a fully enlightened Buddha, but he's not yet started the function of a Buddha. He's reached the anuttara sammasambodhi, the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment, but not yet turned that enlightenment into the expression of the Dhamma. So we have Mara's troops have been dispelled, all of the traces of ignorance are gone, and he's sitting there recognizing that he has reached the final goal that he has sought for such a long time. Okay, after several weeks of sort of pondering the Dhamma, assimilating his realization, the thought occurs to him. And this is a very, very interesting passage. Should I try to teach the Dhamma to others? And then he thinks, this Dhamma that I have realized is very, very difficult to see, difficult to understand. It's profound, sublime, excellent, beyond the range of thinking and reflection, something to be penetrated by people with profound wisdom. But people are not interested in a Dhamma like this. If I were to try to teach it, I just speaking and speaking and speaking, and people want entertainment. They'll be sitting there with their cell phones, I'm lecturing, and they're looking with their cell phones. What's on the news? What are the latest videos? Or, they'll start chit-chatting, or I'm speaking, and then they'll think, oh, interesting, very interesting, very interesting. Okay, so then he thinks, okay, I'm not going to teach. I could enjoy my time here in the forest, dwelling very peacefully, save myself the trouble of trying to teach. Okay, and when his mind leans towards inaction, not towards teaching, something momentous happens. Again, we have to bring the video camera in. This is part of my movie. If we have any directors here, film directors, please consult with me about the script. Okay, from one of the high divine realms, a deity by the name of Brahma Sahampati thinks to himself, the Buddha is fully enlightened now. but he is not interested in teaching the Dhamma. So Brahma Sahampati, he disappears from the Brahma world. He appears before the Buddha. And now the Buddha is a human being. Brahma Sahampati is a divinity. But he bows down to the Buddha because the Buddha, through his enlightenment, superior to Brahma Sahampati. And then he raises his hand in Anjali and he says, Bhante, please don't think in that way. True, the Dhamma is difficult to understand. But there are people with little dust in their eyes who will be able to understand the Dhamma. Okay, now this is a passage. It always brings question to my mind. You know, we have the story that comes in the commentaries that during the time of Dipankara Buddha, the future Buddha was an ascetic named Sumedha. He bowed down when Sumedha met the Buddha Dipankara. He bowed down in the mud. He made the determination, in the future I'm going to become a Sammasambuddha in order to liberate countless beings from samsara. Then he practices the 10 paramitas, 10 in the Theravada system, 6 in the Mahayana system, practices the paramitas for many thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives, all to attain Buddhahood. Now he achieves Buddhahood, he has the opportunity to teach, and he thinks, too difficult, can't do it. Why is this? Has he actually abandoned his original intention? Okay, this is my own understanding, my interpretation. After reaching Buddhahood, if the Buddha were to decide on his own to go out and to start teaching, it would be like he was trying to lay, if I can use an American hippie expression, he would be trying to lay his trip on other people. And so the Buddha has to show, by this decision to remain silent, that he's beyond all attachment, even the attachment to the mission of teaching. And so when the Buddha makes that decision, it sort of gives an invitation to the world through its representative. Brahma Sahampati is the representative of the world coming to the Buddha and pleading with him to teach. And so now the Buddha, through his enlightenment, is in a sense beyond the world. But before the Buddha can re-enter the world to start teaching, the world, represented by Brahma Sahampati, has to implore the Buddha to start teaching. And so when Brahma makes this request to the Buddha, then the Buddha looks out upon the world with his Buddha Chakku, his Buddha vision, and he sees that people are like lotus flowers in different stages of growth within a pond. In the pond, there are some lotus flowers which are buried beneath the mud and won't come up out of the mud. Those are like people completely covered with ignorance. There are some lotus flowers that are gradually growing through the muddy water. Those are like people who are starting to mature, but still they need further cultivation, not yet ready for the Dhamma. But there are some lotus flowers that are just near the surface of the water, and they need only the light of the sun in order to open up and blossom. And so those are like the people who have mature spiritual faculties, but they're not able to become enlightened on their own. They need the teaching of the Buddha to awaken. And so the Buddha says it's out of compassion, especially for those people who have the capacity to awaken, but they need the teaching, that he makes that decision to go forth and to start teaching. And so the sutta continues by telling us how the Buddha went from Bodh Gaya, he got up from his seat beneath the Bodhi tree and walked that long distance to Sanat, to the deer park at Isipatana, where he met the 5 ascetics and started teaching the Dhamma. This is the setting in motion, the Dhamma Chakra Pavatana, setting in motion the wheel of the Dhamma, the wheel that started to turn right there in Sanat. And even though we say that the Buddha's enlightenment took place at Bodh Gaya, but we could say that Buddhism itself, as the chief of the Sanat Buddhist monastery told us yesterday when we were there, Buddhism, he said, began not at Bodh Gaya, but at Sanat. And so it's there that the Buddha Dhamma began to turn, the wheel of Dhamma began to turn, and started to revolve through 2,500 plus years till we come to the present day. It revolved through India, through something like 1,600 years. From India, it spread eastward, first southward to the countries of South and Southeast Asia, eastward to the countries of East Asia, northward to the countries of the Himalayan region, and now it's spreading and turning westward to the countries of the West till we come to the present day. And now just very briefly, I want to mention what I take to be 5 special qualities or characteristics of the Buddha's original teachings, which make it extremely suitable for our contemporary spiritual situation. Because we are now living at a time, I would say, when human life is in serious danger. Because on the one hand, we have the rise of materialism and consumerism, especially coming out of the so-called the materially developed countries of the West. And then as a kind of, in opposition to this, the arising of dogmatic forms of religious fundamentalism and fanaticism, also bringing harm and destruction to many peoples around the world. So the way I summarize 5 basic qualities of the early Buddhist teachings, one, I say, is its realistic analysis of the human condition. It looks at human life realistically, analyzing the fundamental problems of human life. The problem, especially focusing on the problem of suffering and looking deeply into the causes of suffering and laying out a realistic way to practice in order to address the fundamental roots of suffering. A second feature of the Dhamma is its ethical purity. The teaching of the Buddha makes ethics the foundation for the whole path. Even though, I have to say, traditional Buddhism is become overlaid by different layers of ritualism and ceremonialism, but the proper teaching or path of the Buddha begins with the undertaking of ethical practices, the 5 precepts, the 10 ways of wholesome action, the morality factors of the Noble Eightfold Path, and especially the roots of the moral observance in Buddhism, the spirit of loving kindness and compassion. A third feature of Buddhism that makes it suitable for our time is its psychological investigation of the human mind. You know, this is quite amazing when we look in the Buddha's discourses, the way the Buddha distinguishes. First, he makes the mind the center of his teaching. He looks deeply into the human mind and distinguishes what are the different states of consciousness, using an ethical division between the unwholesome mind and the wholesome mind. And then he breaks down the mind into its constituent factors and enumerates what are the unwholesome factors that cause suffering and bondage, what are the wholesome factors that lead to purity and liberation. Okay, so the third is the psychological approach of the Buddha. The fourth, what was the fourth? I remember what the fifth is, but I had a fourth. Okay, I'll come to the fifth. Maybe when I'm explaining the fifth, I'll remember the fourth. Okay, the fifth is that it's a practical teaching, in that the Buddha is not interested in weaving metaphysical theories and providing sort of extensive, philosophical speculative systems, but the Buddha's concern is always practical. So the Buddha's path proceeds through the practice of, we begin with the ethical observances, and then because of its psychological analysis, we come to the methods of mind training. In fact, that was the fourth, was the emphasis on mind training. So the Buddha provides methods of training the mind that enable us to know and to understand our mind in order to transform the mind and ultimately to liberate the mind. And then what I would call the fifth aspect of the Buddha's teaching is that it has the potential, even though in the Buddha's time it was often given as an individualized teaching for personal practice, but if we take these fundamental principles of the Buddha's teaching and apply them to the situation of our own time, we could see how they could provide a remedy to the momentous global challenges that we face today. Problems of constant warfare and conflict, particularly over struggles for wealth and over doctrines and views. The problem of glaring economic inequality. The Buddha teaches that it's the task of the government, as represented by the Chakravarti Raja, to provide for the welfare of all beings within his realm. So when we apply that to contemporary situation, we could say it's the responsibility of the government to provide for the welfare of all the citizens within the realm. And also the Buddha's values of simplicity, contentment, and balancing material well-being with spiritual growth can provide an answer to the overwhelming materialism and consumerism that we're facing today. Okay, so these are some thoughts about the contemporary relevance of the Buddha's teaching with which I want to leave you. So I thank you all for your attention, and sitting here beneath the Bodhi tree, I wish you the blessings of the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. I'll recite some verses to share the merits. So we want to share the merits from this Dhamma discourse with the devas, the deities, particularly the Dhamma protecting deities, with the nagas or dragon spirits, and the bhutas and the fierce spirits. Akasa ta chabhumata deva naga mehitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu loka sasanam. Akasa ta chabhumata deva naga mehitika punyantang anumoditva chirang rakantu desanam. Akasata Chabumaka Devanaga Mahidika Punyantang Anumoditva Chirang Rakantumang Parang Etavatacham Hehi Sampadang Punya Sampadang Sabbe Deva Anumodantu Sabbe Bhuta Anumodantu Sabbe Satanumodantu Sabba Sampati Siddhya Bhavagupadaya Vichihetato Etantare Satakayupapanna Parupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Dukha Pamuchantu Pusantu Nibuting Sadhu Sadhu.
Sitting under the sacred Bodhi tree, we are spellbound listening to the most venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, who has been serving the Dhamma for more than 50 years and is still continuing through his writings and speeches. So we are very much grateful to him. I have a long list, I don't want to read. His works, countless, maybe I have a 2 pages list, I don't want to read it. All has been done by work done by Venerable. So we are very much thankful to him, very much grateful.
The Bodh Gaya Temple Management Committee is extremely grateful to the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi for sparing his time during his brief visit to Bodh Gaya. We now conclude today's this gathering, and I, on behalf of the Bodh Gaya Temple Management Committee, thank all the venerable monks and lamas from different monasteries and institutions in Bodh Gaya, many pilgrims who have assembled here to listen the Most Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. Thank you so much.